The call started like every other cost review I had survived in my career. Calm voices. Polite smiles I could hear through the screen. The senior executive spoke about alignment efficiency and future direction as if he were reading weather updates. When he said my role was being eliminated, he did not pause for reaction. He assumed professionalism meant acceptance. I listened without interrupting because women like me learned long ago that composure is armor. Around that virtual table, I felt the quiet relief of people who believed the expensive problem had finally been solved by leadership standards today alone. I had entered that company decades earlier when systems were fragile and promises mattered. I stayed through mergers, audits, lawsuits, and recoveries that never reached the press. My work lived in margins, notes, procedures, and habits passed quietly between teams. I was never the loudest voice in meetings, but I was the one people called when things stopped making sense. Age had not slowed me. It had sharpened my instincts. Yet on that call, my history was reduced to a line item. Something old. Something heavy. Something easy to remove without hesitation, reflection, respect, context, or understanding that day forward. No one defended me. That part did not surprise me. Corporate rooms reward momentum, not memory. Faces stayed neutral, cameras remained on, and the meeting moved forward efficiently. I noticed who avoided eye contact and who nodded too quickly. I noticed who typed while my name disappeared from the agenda. Experience teaches observation before reaction. I closed my notebook slowly and shut down my screen. Years of surviving spaces, not built for women like me, had trained me for this moment. Silence was not weakness. It was calculation shaped by years of restraint, discipline, patience, dignity, earned quietly over time. After the call ended, I remained seated listening to the hum of my office. No anger arrived, only clarity. I had watched this pattern before unfold in different forms. Remove the person who remembers why rules exist and replace them with someone who believes speed equals intelligence. They assume nothing breaks because nothing has yet. That assumption is always temporary. I did not call anyone. I did not send messages. I reviewed my calendar and made a small note beside that date. Certain outcomes require distance to develop fully before revealing their true cost to unprepared leadership structures everywhere eventually. By evening, I had already detached emotionally from the decision. When you reach a certain age, survival teaches efficiency of feeling. I thought about the systems I built, layers most executives never see. Safeguards, quiet checks, approvals embedded to prevent reckless shortcuts. They were never designed to punish anyone. They existed to protect the company from confident ignorance. On that call, no one asked what those systems required to function safely. They assumed removal meant control. They forgot continuity has a voice even when the builder leaves behind closed processes, unseen, respected only when missing under pressure later, suddenly, painfully. The next morning, nothing had visibly changed for them. Meetings continued, confidence remained intact. For me, the shift was internal. I stopped protecting outcomes I would no longer be responsible for. That is a quiet but powerful moment. Women like me learn it without ceremony. I knew decisions would now be made without historical context. I knew impatience would guide hands unfamiliar with consequences. I also knew systems do not respond to titles. They respond to inputs. And some inputs reveal themselves faster than others once authority ignores wisdom, experience, patience, memory, structure, history, quietly embedded within operations already waiting. That afternoon, I received a calendar reminder I had set years earlier tied to system review cycles. I smiled briefly. Not out of satisfaction, but recognition. Experience teaches patterns repeat when lessons are skipped. They believed the firing ended my relevance. They believed legacy meant obsolete. What they did not notice was the smallest detail buried beneath that call. A safeguard designed to require judgment before speed. It had not been removed. It had been overlooked. And from that moment forward, the clock had already started counting for them quietly, precisely, without drama, warning, apology, noise, delay, mercy, pause, correction. When they called me legacy, they meant outdated, but my history did not begin in that meeting. I entered the company when fax machines still mattered and trust was handwritten. I learned every system by touch, memory, and repetition because no one slowed down to teach women who looked like me. I stayed late not to impress, but to understand why things worked. Over time, I became the quiet reference point people relied on without knowing my name anchored their confidence every day. That quiet consistency became my signature long before titles ever followed my work inside the organization quietly. Legacy for me meant remembering every failure the company never admitted publicly. It meant building safeguards after watching good people panic under pressure. I documented processes others kept in their heads because memory leaves with ego. I trained teams quietly knowing credit rarely travels toward women who prevent disasters. I built redundancy not for recognition but for survival. Every system had fingerprints of patience, discipline, and caution shaped by years of being ignored until something broke unexpectedly. Those invisible decisions carried weight long after meetings ended, and executives moved on confidently believing systems protected themselves automatically without experienced oversight present. I was never the loudest voice in the room, and that was deliberate. Loudness invites resistance, while steadiness builds trust slowly. I listened more than I spoke, absorbing patterns, habits, shortcuts, excuses. Over decades, relationships formed not through lunches, but through reliability. People learned I would answer at midnight and stay calm at dawn. That consistency became infrastructure itself. When leadership changed, my work remained because systems remember care longer than applause or ambition ever does. Even when my name faded from slides, the foundation continued, holding everything upright beneath strategies, quarterly shifts, and reorganizations that never stopped coming quietly. Legacy was never about age for me. It was about accountability carried across time. I remembered why certain approvals existed and which shortcuts caused harm. I protected the company from repeating its worst lessons. That kind of work rarely earns applause. It earns silence because nothing collapses. Women like me learn early that prevention looks like absence, not achievement. When everything functions, people assume it was easy. They never see the cost of vigilance. Those years sharpened judgment, patience, and restraint in environments that rewarded speed over care, without recognizing who slowed disasters before they reached headlines and public blame. Looking back, I realized legacy also meant carrying emotional weight. Being the only woman in rooms where decisions shaped thousands of lives. Being trusted with responsibility, but excluded from celebration. I learned to let outcomes speak for me. Over time, I stopped correcting assumptions. I documented instead. I prepared instead. I accepted that respect often arrives only after absence exposes value clearly. That patience was not weakness, it was survival refined through years of quiet endurance. I watched others rise quickly then fall because foundations were never secured. My work stayed standing long after they left, without ceremony, applause, recognition. When they used legacy as a reason to remove me, they revealed misunderstanding, not truth. They saw age, not architecture. They saw cost, not continuity. What they missed was how much stability they inherited without effort. Systems do not forget their builders. They carry intentions forward silently. Removing the person who understands those intentions does not erase them. It only exposes how dependent leadership had become without realizing it. That realization arrives painfully when shortcuts meet reality under pressure suddenly. Legacy is revealed only after it disappears from the room and leaves silence behind, heavy, undeniable, expensive, and instructional lessons. That is when people finally understand what legacy really meant. Not age, not resistance, not comfort. Legacy is the invisible labor that keeps everything intact until someone removes it. Only then does its absence speak louder than presence ever could. By the time they noticed me, missing the system had already begun teaching its lesson quietly. And I knew without celebration or bitterness that my work would be understood only after it was gone. Legacy never announces itself early, it waits for removal to reveal truth. That truth arrives expensive, undeniable, and impossible to ignore for anyone paying attention finally. He arrived 2 weeks after my exit, full of certainty and polished ambition. I had seen his type before, men who treated confidence like currency and speed like brilliance. Leadership adored him immediately. His presentations sparkled with charts and colors that implied mastery. He spoke quickly, moved quickly, and made decisions with the assurance of someone who had only seen success and assumed it came from instinct rather than understanding. They called him fresh energy. They never noticed how shallow his grasp truly was. I watched the transition quietly, not with bitterness, but with recognition born from years of witnessing the same cycle unfold. He studied documents the way people skim headlines, taking in enough to feel informed, but not enough to understand cause and consequence. Where I had built processes slowly through trial, error, and refinement, he preferred shortcuts that made metrics jump instantly. He changed approval flows within days, eliminating steps he believed slowed progress. Leadership loved it. Numbers rose. Response times decreased. He introduced dashboards designed to impress rather than protect. In meetings, he spoke over concerns gently raised by the few who remembered why certain rules existed. He told them the company was entering a new era of efficiency. What leadership failed to see was the cost hidden beneath his speed. Experience teaches patience because it has lived through the fallout of impatience. Youth often believes fallout is avoidable through confidence alone. He thought structure existed to restrict him rather than preserve the company. When he removed safeguards, he called it modernization. When he cut review layers, he called it simplification. He never asked why they were there. He assumed everything that preceded him belonged to a less intelligent time. That assumption is common among people praised too early and questioned too rarely. I watched from a distance through colleagues who still called me out of habit when confusion surfaced. They told me about his pace the way people describe storms moving in. He reorganized systems without understanding their architecture. He changed vendor access before reading contract limitations. He altered financial permissions with a few keystrokes because the dashboard suggested efficiency improvements. He even rewrote guidelines I had created after a crisis he had never heard about. Leadership applauded the momentum. They interpreted risk-taking as innovation rather than carelessness. Across the company, people adjusted to his style because adjusting felt easier than challenging. Younger employees admired his boldness. Older ones exchanged glances, but said nothing. I understood their silence. Raising warnings makes you sound resistant even when you are right. Women like me have lived long enough to know that truth. So the building moved at his pace, unaware that behind the flashy improvements, small cracks were forming quietly. Cracks in finance approvals. Cracks in workflow logic. Cracks in oversight controls. None of them loud. All of them predictable. I had documented every major system transition during my years there. He skimmed those files quickly, believing his understanding was complete after a single read. He trusted intuition where I trusted history. He believed numbers on dashboards were reality, where I trusted the story behind them. Dashboards can lie when the foundations beneath them are disturbed. He never paused long enough to consider that truth. Leadership remained delighted because nothing had broken yet. That is the dangerous part of speed. Success gives illusion until reality catches up. One afternoon, a colleague told me about a particularly confident decision he made that morning. He removed a verification step inside a financial workflow because it duplicated effort in his eyes. He wanted to streamline. He wanted to reduce lag. He believed the company would appreciate the time saved. He shared the update proudly in a team meeting and received nods of approval from people eager to appear adaptable. No one questioned him because questioning ambition can appear outdated. They forgot that stability takes years to build and seconds to compromise. When I heard about that change, I felt a familiar heaviness settle in my chest. Not fear, not satisfaction, recognition. That step he removed had been placed there after a painful lesson years earlier, a lesson involving near catastrophic loss that still lived in my memory even if it had vanished from theirs. It looked harmless on paper. It looked unnecessary in metrics. It looked outdated to someone who judged systems by visual simplicity. But systems are not judged by how they look. They are judged by how they respond under pressure. He believed he had improved the process. I knew he had opened a door no one intended to unlock again. And once a door like that opens, the cost always finds its way through quietly. Everything began with a notification that appeared on the executive's tablet while he moved between conference rooms, a single line of text that should have prompted reflection instead of haste. He skimmed it with the confidence of someone accustomed to decisions carrying weight simply because he made them. Pressure crowded his schedule, and rather than pause, he acted on instinct, approving a change designed for convenience rather than caution in less than 10 seconds. He believed efficiency defined leadership, and he moved through the day with the certainty of a man who had never been forced to confront the consequences of his own speed. The system he altered contained layers born from past emergencies he knew nothing about. Those layers protected the company from silent failures, the kind that reveal themselves only after damage settles. His decision felt harmless because nothing seemed to resist it in that moment. I had built those protections years earlier after watching panic spread across departments when a similar shortcut nearly destroyed a quarterly budget. That history lived in my memory, even if leadership had forgotten. Loss teaches carefulness, but only to those who carried the weight of fixing it. He saw the approval step as redundancy rather than wisdom. Without context, he trusted his intuition more than structure, unaware that intuition becomes dangerous when it moves faster than understanding. The change he approved triggered a sequence that appeared smooth on the surface. No alarm sounded because the system followed the logic he unknowingly disrupted. Automated tasks executed in perfect rhythm, processing his decision as legitimate. The financial pipeline moved funds the way it always had, except now a vital confirmation step was missing. In a world built on precision, even one removed pause can alter outcomes in ways the untrained eye cannot anticipate. He returned to his meetings unaware that the system had already interpreted his decision with rigid obedience. Software does not question authority. It follows commands. That truth becomes unforgiving when authority is misapplied. While he discussed projections and future initiatives, numbers in the background shifted quietly, aligning themselves with a path he unknowingly cleared. The movement was clean, efficient, and invisible, the kind of precision that makes errors look intentional until someone investigates. Somewhere inside the finance department, a discrepancy would soon appear, though no one noticed it yet. The system had processed a transfer exactly as instructed, releasing funds without resistance. $50,000 moved through the channels reserved for approved transactions, and because his action carried executive credentials, every checkpoint recognized it as valid. The loss did not scream or flash warnings. It settled into the ledger with the quiet confidence of legitimacy. At that same moment, I sat at home reviewing notes unrelated to the company, unaware of the exact timing but familiar with the inevitability. Experience offers a sense for when systems will reveal truth, especially when someone inexperienced alters their rhythm. I felt no satisfaction, only certainty. The decision he made reflected not malice but ignorance. The cost it created was the natural echo of choices made without understanding the history beneath them. He believed he had improved efficiency. I knew he had removed protection. These moments define the difference between youth and experience. Younger leaders often assume progress is measured by how quickly they can alter what came before. Older ones understand progress requires knowing which parts must remain untouched. He treated the system like a blank canvas rather than a structure shaped by years of hard lessons. That misunderstanding carried a price he never anticipated. By the time the discrepancy reached someone with enough awareness to question it, the money was already gone. The system had completed the transaction exactly as designed, following the path opened 10 seconds earlier. Confusion would soon spread across departments as analysts tried to trace the origin of the change. In those moments, leadership would finally recognize that removing the woman who built the system did not erase her work. It erased their safety. The loss marked the moment impatience revealed its cost. $50,000 vanished because one person believed experience could be replaced with speed. That error would become the turning point none of them could ignore. The first sign that something was wrong appeared in finance early the next morning. A junior analyst reviewing routine reconciliations noticed a number that did not match its source. At first, she assumed it was a timing issue, the kind that corrects itself once all reports finish processing. She refreshed the screen twice before realizing the discrepancy remained fixed. $50,000 had moved out without the corresponding verification that normally accompanied transactions of that size. She called her supervisor quietly, unsure whether she had discovered an error or simply misunderstood an update no one had communicated. Her supervisor frowned as he leaned closer to the monitor. He entered his credentials to access deeper logs and felt a slow tension rise in his chest when he saw how clean the transfer looked. Nothing about the transaction seemed suspicious. It carried the appropriate credentials. It followed an approved route. Yet something felt wrong. Experience teaches professionals that mistakes often appear most convincing when they follow all the rules on paper. He sent a message to another department asking for cross-verification, hoping someone would provide a simple explanation that calmed the growing unease in the room. Across the building, IT received the inquiry and began tracing system activity. They expected to find an anomaly, a glitch, a corrupt timestamp, anything that would justify the movement. Instead, they found silence. Every log indicated that the system behaved perfectly. Commands executed cleanly. Permission levels aligned. No irregular patterns appeared. The unsettling part was not the transfer itself, but the absence of conflict in its trail. One of the engineers leaned back slowly and whispered that this kind of movement should have triggered at least one confirmation step. That step was missing, and none of them could explain why. Legal became involved after IT sent them a summary that raised more questions than answers. Compliance officers scanned through audit trails looking for procedural justification. They expected to find documentation authorizing a change. Instead, they found only the transaction and the access signature that validated it. Someone asked whether the missing checkpoint had been intentionally removed. Someone else asked who had the authority to alter financial controls. The room grew heavy as they realized the answer pointed in one direction. They began to ask when the change had been made and why it had gone unnoticed until now. Meetings were interrupted across departments as leaders attempted to piece together the timeline. Voices stayed polite but carried urgency. Loss demands clarity, and clarity was missing. They reconstructed the previous day minute by minute until the truth began to form. A small approval setting had been modified by someone high enough to bypass oversight. The executive responsible claimed he had simply streamlined one workflow. He defended himself by saying the old structure felt unnecessary. Then he tried to reassure the group by insisting that the number could be recovered. Finance corrected him with tired eyes. The money had already settled. Someone in the room finally mentioned my name quietly, as if speaking it might change the air. They remembered I had created the original safeguard after a loss years earlier. They remembered I understood the history behind each step because I had lived through the reasons they existed. They remembered I had warned them once that removing context creates consequences. That memory spread through the room, not with guilt, but with recognition. My absence suddenly felt heavier than my presence ever had. The safeguard had not protected them because the safeguard had been removed by someone who believed he understood more than history. The executive who had approved the change stopped speaking when he saw the faces around him. The confidence he carried the day before no longer felt deserved. He realized the transaction did not break the system. It followed the rules he had unknowingly rewritten. That truth pressed against him more forcefully than accusation. He understood too late that experience guides caution for reasons newcomers rarely comprehend. The room waited for him to offer a solution, but leadership often goes quiet when consequences reveal themselves. Silence settled for several seconds as the weight of the situation became undeniable. Someone asked whether contacting me would help. The question lingered because no one wanted to admit they needed the woman they dismissed without hesitation. Eventually, the executive nodded slowly, not out of humility, but necessity. The company required the insight of the person who understood why things worked rather than how they appeared. He realized in that moment that removing me had not simplified his work. It had exposed his limits. The call they never wanted to make had become the only option left. Morning light filtered through my curtains when their world began to unravel, though I had no reason to expect a call or a message from anyone connected to that company. My days had become quieter since leaving, shaped by work that valued clarity rather than speed. I was consulting for a community organization that trusted my judgment, building systems meant to last. Chaos belonged to those who dismissed what they never understood. People assumed I felt bitterness after being pushed aside, but age teaches restraint where pride once lived. I had watched too many careers collapse under the weight of anger to mistake silence for defeat. My time was filled with meaningful responsibilities, not memories of a place that confused visibility with value. I guided younger consultants through problems they believed impossible. They listened differently than executives ever did, perhaps because they recognized the steadiness in my voice. My calendar stayed full because reputation travels quietly when earned over years rather than moments. Invitations arrived from organizations that valued structure instead of showmanship. I found comfort in work done with intention, surrounded by people who understood that excellence grows slowly. Even in this new chapter, one maintained the habits that shaped my career, reviewing data carefully and documenting every detail. Discipline protected me long before titles ever did, and it continued to guide each decision. I rarely thought about the company that released me. Distance gave me clarity free from disappointment. I knew they would feel my absence eventually, just as every organization does when it overlooks the unseen work that keeps it steady. Still, I felt no triumph imagining their confusion. Maturity teaches that life punishes arrogance without help. I simply carried on, pouring my experience into projects that appreciated the wisdom hardship teaches to those who endure long enough to apply it. When the phone finally rang the next afternoon, I did not rush to answer. Experience has taught me that urgency from others does not require urgency from me. I let it ring long enough to finish my notes before picking up. The voice on the other end carried a stiffness I recognized immediately, the kind that appears when confidence collapses. He explained there had been a situation, and they needed my expertise to understand what happened. I listened without offering comfort. People reveal truth when silence holds them. He described the discrepancy they discovered and the confusion spreading across departments. He tried to soften the embarrassment by insisting the issue was minor, but the strain in his voice betrayed him. As he spoke, I pictured the ripple moving through their offices, each person realizing a missing safeguard had created vulnerability. He paused before asking if I would return temporarily to assist. I considered his request carefully. My value did not decrease when they released me, and it did not increase because they now face loss. I understood the system better than anyone remaining there, but understanding did not obligate me to hurry back. I weighed the peace of my current life against the responsibility of correcting a mistake they created. Wisdom teaches that returning too quickly erases lessons meant to reshape the people who caused the damage. Eventually, I agreed to help, but only under terms that protected my dignity. I spoke with steady confidence, setting boundaries shaped by years of being overlooked. The executive accepted everything without hesitation, exposing how deeply the loss had frightened him. I ended the call with calm finality. I had not sought revenge. I had not wished for their failure. I simply honored my worth, and for the first time they recognized it without argument or delay. I placed the phone aside and allowed the quiet to settle because it reminded me of how far I had come from the woman who once absorbed burdens without rest. My home felt peaceful, my work felt meaningful, and my confidence no longer depended on proving anything to people who saw me as replaceable. I breathed slowly and prepared for the task ahead with intention shaped by years of endurance. When I finally returned the call, I did so entirely on my terms, and no one questioned the timing at that quiet moment. When I walked into the conference room, the atmosphere shifted before anyone spoke. People who once looked through me now watched every movement with a stillness that revealed their discomfort. They had expected my presence to reassure them, but experience gives a woman a different kind of authority, one that settles quietly instead of announcing itself. I offered a polite greeting and took the seat I preferred, not the one they suggested. Choosing your place is the first reminder of agency. No one objected. They needed answers more than they needed pride. The executive who approved the faulty change cleared his throat as if rehearsing an apology. I did not help him. I wanted clarity, not performance. He attempted to explain what he called an unintended adjustment meant to improve workflow, but even he did not seem convinced by his own words. His voice had lost the confidence he displayed when he believed speed signaled intelligence. I listened without interruption, allowing him to feel the weight of his own choices before I responded. Silence can be more instructive than correction. When he finally stopped speaking, I opened my folder calmly. I had reviewed the logs earlier that morning and traced the problem within minutes. Understanding systems built over years is not difficult when you design their logic. I placed a printed sheet in the center of the table. On it were 3 timestamps. The first captured the moment he altered the approval rule. The second recorded the automated confirmation that followed. The third marked the precise instant the funds moved. I watched comprehension tighten across his face as he read the sequence. I explained the situation in plain language. My tone never shifted. There was no anger, because anger would have offered him an excuse to dismiss the lesson. I described the purpose of the removed safeguard, reminding them of the crisis years earlier that led to its creation. Some nodded as memory returned, though others looked away in discomfort. They realized the missing step was not inefficient but protective. It existed to slow decisions made without enough information, a protection their leadership underestimated until cost revealed the truth. He asked why the system did not alert him. I answered with calm precision. The system did exactly what it was designed to do. It trusted whoever carried the highest credentials. Removing a safeguard is not the system's failure. It is human assumption pretending to be improvement. His authority bypassed every barrier because authority was the only requirement the system recognized. I could see the impact of that explanation settling heavily on him. It is difficult for people who see themselves as competent to realize they created the problem they now fear. I watched the tension move across the room as people confronted the reality of their earlier enthusiasm. They had celebrated his speed without questioning its consequences. Leadership often mistakes motion for progress, and in doing so they dismiss caution as resistance. I had warned them years before that oversight must be treated with respect, not impatience. They remembered that now. They remembered because the cost had made the memory unavoidable. He asked what could have been done to prevent the loss. The answer was simple. He could have asked why the step existed before removing it. He could have paused long enough to understand the architecture he altered. Wisdom would have told him that systems built across decades contain reasons that cannot be summarized in a sentence. I did not say these words unkindly. I said them as truth, shaped by years of watching people repeat mistakes that never needed to happen. The room fell silent again, but this silence was different. It was not tension. It was recognition. They understood that the damage did not come from complexity. It came from disregard. A woman they dismissed as outdated had been the only person who knew how the pieces fit together. That knowledge was not dramatic. It was earned over years of uninterrupted commitment. I concluded the explanation by showing them a single line of code the system relied on to validate high-level approvals. The line had always required a secondary confirmation. When he removed the step, he unlocked that function unintentionally. The loss had been preventable. The discomfort that entered his expression reflected his understanding of that fact. He realized that the mistake was not in the system. It was in his assumption that the woman who built it was unnecessary. The power dynamic shifted quietly across the table. I did not need to raise my voice. Truth had spoken for me, and everyone in the room heard it clearly. The room was different when the discussion shifted from explanation to responsibility. The executive who caused the loss sat with his hands pressed flat against the table, as if studying himself against the truth he now understood. I watched the tension settle across his shoulders. That tension had nothing to do with fear of me. It came from recognizing the limits of his own judgment. I allowed the silence to stretch because silence teaches more than reprimand. They needed to feel the weight of what they had dismissed. When I finally spoke, I kept my tone even. Age teaches that raising your voice wastes strength. I told them I would help recover what could still be salvaged. I made it clear that my involvement would require structure. Their mistake was born from ignoring structure, and I had no intention of repeating their pattern. Several people nodded quickly, grateful for any sign of cooperation. Gratitude is common once consequences appear. I had seen that pattern throughout my career. Before discussing terms, I outlined the scope of work calmly. I explained that reversing damage required more than technical adjustments. It required reviewing every change made since my departure. It required identifying which controls had been weakened and which remained intact. It required restoring order to a system they had treated like a playground. They listened with the seriousness of people who now understood the price of disorder. When I finished, the executive asked for my rates. He tried to sound composed, but his voice carried an unsteady edge that revealed his discomfort. He expected bitterness. He expected inflated numbers meant to punish him. I saw that expectation clearly. Women like me are often assumed to carry resentment silently until the moment we are asked to step in again. He expected revenge disguised as professionalism. Instead, I told him the truth. My consulting fee had been the same for years. It reflected experience, not ego. It reflected values shaped through decades of work, not emotion tied to a single incident. I had nothing to prove and nothing to avenge. My rate stood firm because my worth had been stable long before they decided I was replaceable. The executive blinked slowly, surprised that I had not taken the opportunity to demand more. His surprise told me everything I needed to know about how he viewed people before he understood their importance. I also explained that my work required full authority to override temporary changes made in my absence. Without that authority, any correction would be fragile and temporary. I would not attach my name to patch solutions that failed months later. Experience teaches that temporary fixes create future crises. I insisted on clarity. No partial permission. No interference. They had ignored guidance once. They would not do so again under my watch. Around the room, people exchanged glances. They understood I was not negotiating. I was establishing boundaries that had been lacking before. Boundaries are uncomfortable for those who benefited from your softness. But maturity teaches that softness must be balanced with self-respect. Their discomfort did not move me. I had lived through enough meetings to recognize the difference between compliance and understanding. I added one more condition. My work would not include mentoring the replacement they hired to fill my role. Training someone who contributed to the problem without recognizing it would undermine the purpose of my return. He would need to learn through observation, not instruction. Growth without accountability is impossible. That final boundary shifted the air in the room again. No one challenged it. They knew his mistakes had been costly. The executive sat back and folded his hands slowly. For the first time since I arrived, he looked directly at me, without the shield of authority. What I saw in his expression was not defeat. It was acceptance. Acceptance that he had misjudged the situation. Acceptance that he had misjudged me. Acceptance that leadership is more than bold decisions made under pressure. He agreed to my terms without hesitation. There was no bargaining. There was no attempt to lower my rate or limit my authority. The speed of his agreement revealed his recognition of the truth. The company needed order restored, and order required the woman they had dismissed without understanding the depth of what they lost. When the meeting ended, I gathered my papers with calm movements. Their respect arrived late, but it arrived fully. And in that moment, the real price of disrespect had finally been paid. The meeting did not end when the papers were gathered and the signatures were accepted. Something much larger lingered in the room, something none of them expected when the day began. Leadership often believes lessons arrive through strategic plans or corporate workshops, but the truth is that companies learn the most from discomfort. That morning discomfort came from witnessing calm authority instead of watching someone crumble. It came from realizing that respect had been misplaced and that silence had covered wisdom they never took the time to understand. The weight of that realization settled slowly across every face in the room. The younger managers were the first to show the shift. Ambition had taught them to move quickly, to speak loudly, to prove themselves through volume and speed. But as they watched the consequences unfold, they saw that experience does not need theatrics to command attention. For the first time, they noticed how much discipline lived inside measured words. They saw that real authority enters a room without needing to announce itself. They exchanged quiet glances as they realized the systems they depended on had been shaped by someone they barely acknowledged. Their posture changed in small but telling ways. The executives who once promoted boldness over caution now sat with still hands, reflecting on the chain of events created by a single decision. Reflection is rare in those who lead, but loss forces honesty. They understood now that my departure had created more than a vacancy. It had removed the living memory that held the company steady. They recognized that the energy they admired in the replacement had been confidence without comprehension. They had rewarded momentum, unaware it was untethered. None of them said these thoughts aloud, but the truth lived clearly in their eyes. Throughout the room, silence replaced the arrogance that once shaped discussions. Not silence born from fear, but silence born from awareness. They did not know how many crises I prevented without speaking. They did not know how many times careful judgment protected them from decisions that might have cost far more than the loss they now faced. They had assumed the absence of disaster meant the absence of labor. That illusion shattered as they reflected on how quickly the system reacted to inexperience once protective layers were removed. The replacement sat farther back in his chair than usual, observing me with a different expression than the one he wore during his introduction weeks earlier. His confidence had softened into something closer to humility. He saw now that speed without wisdom is a risk disguised as progress. He heard the unspoken message that leadership had not delivered to him directly. He witnessed the consequences of not questioning his own assumptions. Youth often mistakes silence for weakness, but he understood now that silence had shielded the company in ways he never recognized. The finance and legal teams studied their notes with a new appreciation for the systems they previously treated as routine. They realized the architecture that guided their work had not appeared magically. It had been constructed deliberately by someone who understood both the company's vulnerabilities and its strengths. They saw the value of continuity in a way they never considered before. For them, the lesson was not simply about a safeguard. It was about respecting the hands that built the structures they depended on. As the meeting progressed, the energy in the room shifted from confusion to recognition. My presence did not intimidate them. It grounded them. They saw that authority built over decades carries a different weight than authority granted by a title. Titles change easily. True authority survives transitions. That distinction reshaped the way they viewed hierarchy. Many of them had spent years in environments where volume and boldness defined leadership. Now they understood that leadership also lives in steadiness and foresight. The executive who initiated the decision looked around the table with a clarity he lacked earlier. He saw the ripple effect his choice created. He saw how small oversights expose larger truths. More importantly, he saw who the room listened to in moments of crisis. They did not look to him for reassurance. They looked to me, not because of status, but because experience had earned trust he assumed he already possessed. When the meeting adjourned, the shift lingered quietly, like a soft imprint on the company's culture. People moved differently. They spoke with more consideration. They treated the system with renewed respect. Something fundamental had changed. The company began to value wisdom not as an accessory, but as an anchor. In that understated transformation, the lessons settled permanently. True authority is not taken. It is recognized. And recognition had finally arrived. In the weeks following the incident, the executive who had made the 10-second decision continued to come to work each morning, but nothing felt the same for him. He still carried the title that once filled him with certainty. He still sat in the corner office with a skyline view meant to symbolize direction and control. Yet the air around him had changed. Respect does not disappear loudly. It fades quietly, like a light dimming while the room remains still. People still greeted him, but the admiration that once followed his presence no longer appeared in their eyes. He was not fired because corporations rarely remove leaders for mistakes they can explain. There was no internal announcement describing the loss. No public embarrassment. The company protected its image, and he benefited from that protection. But even without formal consequences, he felt the shift every time a colleague paused before accepting his recommendations. He noticed the subtle hesitation when younger managers asked for clarification. He noticed the way they now cross-checked his decisions with documentation they once ignored. Trust that dissolves never returns in its original form. He began spending more time reviewing procedures he had once considered unnecessary. He read policy notes he used to skim. He asked quiet questions of people he had overlooked earlier in his career. These actions did not emerge from humility alone. They emerged from fear of repeating the damage he caused. Fear has a way of reshaping people, especially those who believe their instincts were enough to carry them. Experience cannot be borrowed. It must be earned through mistakes that force honesty. Behind closed doors, he revisited the reports from the day the money disappeared. He read every detail slowly, recognizing that each line represented a history he had never taken the time to learn. He realized how many decisions he had made based on confidence rather than comprehension. It was not shame that troubled him, but awareness. Awareness that he had misjudged the woman who built the systems he disturbed. Awareness that her approach, which he once dismissed as outdated, had protected the company more effectively than his innovations ever could. He noticed something else as well. Meetings changed. The energy shifted away from fast declarations toward thoughtful listening. Managers began to reference documentation written long before he arrived. People who had been silent in the past now contributed with cautious confidence. He understood that the shift did not come from his leadership. It came from watching the consequences of what happened under his leadership. Culture does not change through speeches. It changes when people witness the cost of ignoring wisdom. He adjusted his behavior in public, but the deeper transformation occurred privately. He became more aware of how he treated staff members who carried institutional memory. He reconsidered the way he evaluated older employees. He paid attention when they described patterns or risks. He no longer dismissed detail-oriented explanations as resistance. Instead, he recognized them as warnings shaped by years of lived experience. His pride softened, not through humiliation but through education. There were nights when he sat alone in his office, replaying the moment he removed the safeguard. He remembered how effortless it felt. He remembered how justified he believed he was. Now that memory carried weight. Weight that would accompany every decision he made from that moment forward. He understood that leadership is not simply about action. It is about understanding the foundations beneath each action. Foundations he had once taken for granted. He also found himself thinking about the woman he dismissed, not with defensiveness or resentment, but with respect that arrived too late to protect his reputation. He realized she had never raised her voice, never demanded recognition, never claimed authority. She allowed the system to speak for her because the truth was embedded in the structure itself. That truth humbled him more effectively than any reprimand. He understood now that her departure had not left a vacancy. It had revealed a void. In conversations with other executives, he adopted a quieter tone, not timid but measured. He no longer rushed decisions or celebrated speed. He asked for context. He asked for history. He asked for insight from people who remembered what he had forgotten to learn. Those around him noticed the shift even if they did not discuss it openly. Influence that once moved through bravado now moved through consideration. His career did not collapse, but it no longer carried the same shine. He remained in his position, yet he understood something he had never considered before. Money is a recoverable loss. Wisdom is not. That realization settled in his mind with the permanence of a lesson that will not be forgotten. In the months that followed, my life moved forward with a steadiness that surprised even me. I expected to feel the echo of everything that happened, but there was no lingering weight or unfinished emotion. When people spoke about closure, they often imagined dramatic endings or public acknowledgments. What they never understood is that real closure comes from knowing you honored yourself even when others failed to recognize your worth. My days were filled with work that appreciated my wisdom, and my evenings carried the peace of someone who no longer felt responsible for holding together a place that undervalued her presence. I continued consulting for organizations that wanted strong foundations rather than quick applause. I mentored women who reminded me of myself at the beginning of my career, women who carried both brilliance and caution in their voices. They listened closely when I explained how experience is often invisible until someone removes it. They understood that perspective grows through years of watching patterns repeat. Each conversation with them reinforced a truth I had lived for decades. Work done with care leaves imprints even in places where recognition arrives late. Occasionally, someone from the old company reached out with a polite update or a question about historical procedures. I responded professionally, but briefly. I no longer carried an emotional connection to the place. My value there had been proven in my absence, not through any celebration of my presence. I felt no desire to return and no urge to witness how they adjusted after the crisis. My chapter with them was complete. Some chapters do not end with applause. They end with understanding, and understanding brought me peace. I heard through colleagues that leadership had rewritten several internal policies, reinstating safeguards once considered unnecessary. Younger managers now treated documentation with respect rather than impatience. Meetings took on a slower rhythm, one shaped by caution instead of ambition. They had learned something the hard way, and while the lesson cost them money, it gave them clarity. I did not need to witness these changes to feel satisfaction. Growth that comes from truth does not require an audience. The replacement who once moved quickly now moved differently. I was told he approached decisions with more care and consulted others before adjusting systems he barely understood months earlier. He had stopped presenting speed as innovation. He learned to value stability not because someone lectured him, but because he had watched the consequences of ignoring it. That transformation reminded me of the lessons age teaches, without asking permission. People grow when they face the results of their choices. Still, I never viewed him as an antagonist. He was simply someone who believed energy could replace understanding. Many begin their careers that way. Wisdom often enters through discomfort. His discomfort had brought him humility, and humility is the foundation of growth. I hoped he continued learning, not for my sake, but for the people depending on his decisions. A leader who understands consequence becomes more careful. Care becomes stability. Stability becomes legacy. As time passed, my world became fuller. I traveled, reconnected with friends, and invested in community projects I once postponed. I found joy in simplicity and pride in resilience. Nothing about my departure felt like loss anymore. It felt like release. The company had been a chapter, not a definition. I no longer carried the weight of proving my worth. I had lived long enough to understand that worth remains steady even when others fail to recognize it. When reflecting on everything that happened, I realized the real lesson had nothing to do with money. It had nothing to do with executives' mistake or the missing safeguard. The lasting truth lay in the way experience had quietly shaped every outcome. People often treat experience as an expense rather than an asset. They see salaries instead of stability. They see age instead of insight. They see cost instead of wisdom. But experience holds value that cannot be measured until it is gone. The company learned that lesson quickly and painfully. I learned something too. I learned that moving on does not require bitterness. It requires clarity. It requires knowing that your contribution cannot be erased by dismissal. It requires trusting that truth reveals itself in time without needing your voice to push it forward. I moved on with confidence because I understood that the world remains steady for those who build steady things. In the end, the story was simple. People who confuse experience with cost pay more than they expect. They pay in silence. They pay in urgency. They pay in consequences that appear suddenly and settle permanently. And when they finally understand the price, the woman they underestimated has already moved forward with a life built on wisdom they never took the time to value.